From the early Wings of Liberty beta, this was one of the first StarCraft matches to be put up on YouTube. This was from the very beginning of the beta when people had no idea what was going on. You could spawn in close positions on any map, and established pro gamers didn't even know what race they were going to play. This was so early on in the Wings of Liberty beta that people were still figuring out the very basics of the matchup and which race they wanted to play, even though they had thousands of hours with each race from Brood War. It was such an exciting time where everything was up in the air, and there was an incredible amount of fervor and anticipation in the scene. And to have a beta key was to be a god at that time because it was a closed beta. It's not like it is now where most games that release betas, it's an open beta or it's a closed beta and then we'll go into, it was like a closed beta where you had to like really get lucky or be a pro gamer to have a beta key. And one thing that's really interesting is both of these guys of the media clan, IdrA, the ace, Artosis, the founder, they played Macro Terran in Brood War, and they're trying to figure out what race is for me in StarCraft 2. And think about the butterfly effect of if both of these guys had stuck to these races in StarCraft 2, because as you guys both know, both of these guys were Macro Zergs at the beginning of Wings of Liberty. And what's interesting about that is Zerg was the hardest race at the beginning of Wings of Liberty, and Artosis was the one who convinced them to do this. He said that there's going to be more stuff to do with Zerg as far as like creep spread and ability to multitask, and the players with the most APM are going to benefit most from playing Zerg. Well, IdrA believed him, and they both play Zerg at the very beginning, and then like after a few months, Artosis switched to Protoss, quipping that with Kydarian Amulet in the game, someone's got to win these tournaments as a Protoss pro gamer. But unfortunately for him, he was just having to cast way too much to be a full-time pro gamer, whereas IdrA was able to continue to be a pro gamer into Heart of the Swarm when he finally called it quits. But remember, IdrA was at the top of the Foreigner scene at the end of Brood War, that like 09, 2010 era. When Brood War was wrapping up and the Wings of Liberty beta came out, IdrA was at the top of his game and was considered the best Foreigner. So Artosis was also very good whenever he went to Korea around that 2009 time, but he didn't get a PC to play on. So he finally has gotten the ability to play and would sort of become a pro gamer at the very beginning of Wings of Liberty and like play in NASL Season 1, try to qualify for the first 2 GSLs, make it into the first few GSLs. I've covered one of the games that he won in my Venomous Classic series on close positions, not Lost Temple no less, as Zerg. See, whenever IdrA and Artosis settled on playing Zerg, that was something that would have a huge ripple effect on the StarCraft 2 scene, because these were like top flight American pro gamers that were greatly respected and at the top of the Brood War scene for years. But then Zerg was very difficult, and it was them trying to figure out how to fast expand on these joke maps with Zerg. Remember, we're talking about a map pool that has Kulos Ravine in it. We're talking about a map pool that has Steps of War in it. Lost Temple, remember, you don't have the Ravager to do with the tank drop. That tank gets dropped up on your high ground. Man, that's brutal. And then Metalopolis is like the macro map, the good map. Well, guess what? Metalopolis, you can spawn in close like this and watch Artosis make double reactor and do a rush with tier 1 units here. This is the sort of like beta build that people think about is IdrA throws up a force field there, traps the Hellions, but without that sentry, it's going to be hard to burst them down, and the Hellions scream in behind the mineral line. And IdrA has a Stalker trying to hold the ramp, and he cleans up both of those Hellions. But remember, the Wings of Liberty ramp up is slower. You start with 6 workers. They mine less efficiently than they do in Heart of the Swarm. The worker AI got better, so these early Wings of Liberty 1 base versus 1 base games would be very scrappy, and we can see IdrA microing that weak Stalker up. We can deduce that based on what the Marines were firing at, even with the health bars off. And we can see in the top right there in the red, IdrA's not floating any money. As soon as his gateway comes off of cooldown, he barely has the money to make another unit. And he's not making an immortal, I don't think, as the lack of production tab is just brutal. Artosis once said that he could cast a game with just the production tab. As Idra decides to go into Robo Bay, as the Colossus was just considered spectacularly powerful in this era. Remember, people would stay on one base, they wouldn't get necessary upgrades, they would do these extended rushes like this. Remember, Artosis is doing a Hellion Marine attack without any medevacs or combat shields or stem, and Idra's trying to hold the top of his ramp here, but with no sentry, Artosis can get cheeky here, push in aggressively, and he does just that. But he's sort of trapped a bit by the stalkers. He can't run in and assault the mineral line, but he is just going to want to push aggressively onto the army until it backs off and then go to the mineral line. Because if he just tried to go straight to the mineral line there, he would be split up and the Marines would be cleaned up. But with an Immortal coming out here, Idra should be able to hold. Immortals do plus damage to armored units. They just eviscerate Hellions. This was what prevented Terran from going mech in StarCraft 2 is holy crap, Idra's going to try to return his workers to mining, and he's going to attack the Hellions as wow. A Hellion gets off a shot there and kills a few workers, as if the other Hellion was aggressed at the same time with the other, a lot of workers would have died. 2 more Hellions run in, but again, the Immortal just stymies this. Even without any forge upgrades, the Immortal just packs such a punch and is so hard to kill. Remember, the standard in Brood War was for the Terran player to go mech, to make Vulture tank, which would be like Hellion tank in this game, right? Where Artosis is sort of saying to himself, okay, I'm churning out lots of tier 1 units with the reactor. Reactor's another thing that we're not in Brood War. So at the beginning of StarCraft 2, you had people applying concepts from Brood War, like, oh man, reactors are really good because I only have to get 1 barracks if I want to do like a fast rush like this. You couldn't do a rush like this in Brood War. A 2 barracks, 2 factory rush, couldn't do it. You had 2 factory rush versus Protoss, but you couldn't afford Marines with that outside. You know, obviously you're going to make a few Marines at the beginning, but you didn't make a second factory for Marines and then do a big push with a ton of Marines. You went Vulture with Mine, or made like a tank with Siege. As Idra goes into Stargate there, Artosis is getting Cloaked Banshees, and it's worth noting that if you got anything out of a building that had a tech lab in it, it would glow up green. So this made it way harder to scout, especially for Zerg, as Idra's going to move out here with a tiny force. And Colossus, remember, they're very good and they decimate tier 1 units and light units, and these Marines do not have combat shield or stem. Artosis going for that sort of 1-1-1 play. This is before 1-1-1 was even a thing. But look at Idra. This is why he went for the Colossus, because, okay, I'm fighting 2 different light units, and he has just seen the starport. And even though the tech lab is glowed up green, he doesn't necessarily know that Artosis is going for Cloak. And there's going to be a bit of a base trade here, as Idra's going to aggress with everything and try to break the ramp. But Artosis has a Banshee out. He's going to get that Banshee to kill the 1 Colossus. And probes are going to be pulled here for the Kraken, but most of them will die, obviously. As a tremendous amount of Hellions are out. Idra's going to try to break Artosis, but a Banshee is going to clean up the Colossus, which is the main punching force of this army. And Idra's lost virtually every worker. As when they did that base trade there, the fact that it was on close positions meant that Idra wasn't able to do a couple warp-ins. Remember, them being on close positions means that they're spawned basically on top of each other. Idra once referred to close positions as worse than steps of war because of the terrain of the third base. You can just launch attacks down from that third into the natural, which is brutal. And Idra's push is going to be held up there by Artosis. And Artosis went for a lot of pressure here. He played it sort of like QXC would, you know, he kept the pressure on, he went into Banshee, and Idra sees how many workers Artosis has, and lights into him a bit there, as these guys were huge friends, remember, this is just a bit of lighthearted banter, they're busting balls, and Artosis knows that he can just fly into Idra's base, and Idra, who is already on death's door, is not going to be able to deal with this, and Idra calls him a fucking newbie, which is just great. Remember, this is the very beginning of Wings of Liberty as Idra leaves. So we'll throw it back again there, just a touch. So With close positions Metalopolis, this is the sort of build that you can get away with. This is the sort of aggressive pressure build that not only works in close positions and not really so much on cross positions, but this is the sort of thing that was very popular in the beta. If you look at any RTS game, and I think the Stargate here is really what kills the Kraken. I think you have to go into a couple extra gates here, but I think in his mind it's like he doesn't have the money for a couple extra gates because you're trying to support one base Colossus, so you really can only afford 2 gates, but maybe an extra third gate here at some point would have helped IdrA out a bit, because even if you're macroing correctly, if you look in the top right, IdrA always has really low minerals and gas, and he's not getting supply blocked and has a full worker line. So he's macroing correctly. It's not like he's floating money and just doesn't have enough gates, but a lot of times if you have that third gate and you're on one base, it can sort of help you hit that extra little warp cycle when you're transitioning, or like, oh, I just started a Colossus. I'm not gonna, like, right here is like one of those. See, he has like 300 minerals, and he got supply blocked there with that last stalker. But that's one of those situations where, oh, it really helps to have that extra gate. But if you give someone, no matter how good they are as RTS players, if you give RTS players like the beta to a new game, a lot of what they're going to do for like the first few weeks is just rush each other with tier 1 units. And one thing that exasperated this was how small the maps were. And if you've watched the Gregathon series, where I look at all of IdrA's GSL games, which I had on a playlist on my channel, you'll know that so many of these early Wings of Liberty games go like this, where it's like, oh, I'm trying to expand and tech up, and the other guy's just like, here's a shitload of tier 1 units you're not ready for and can't really scout. And a lot of Wings of Liberty was like that. And Artosis was known as a huge macro player, and you can see that even Artosis is sort of playing like that. Like, well, I'll get a reactor on each of these buildings and poke around a bit. And the reason that we never saw Mech versus Terran is the Immortal. For years, like, people would point this out and Terran players would whine about it, like, oh, why can't we go Mech against Protoss? That's what we did in Brood War. Because remember, at the beginning of this Wings of Liberty beta, people were just trying to do the same thing that they did in Wings of Liberty. Or the same thing that they did in Brood War, in Wings of Liberty, rather. So, like, oh, people would try to go Muta versus Terran, for instance, and it was like, oh, you can't really stack the Mutas. Like, the Mutas aren't useful in the same way that they are in Brood War. Or like, oh, I'm gonna go Mech versus Protoss, and the Protoss just mass expands, gets 2 Robos and goes Immortals, and the Immortals cut through your army because of the hardened shield or whatever it was called at this time, where you can only take so much damage per shot with the mortals at this time. So obviously tanks are good because they hit for a shitload of damage and like one big slow attack, but you could just run in with like Speed Zealot Immortal and kill a whole Terran army. And I love that IdrA like had this probe up here spotting the whole time. He knew what Artie was doing. And if you fast forward even a couple weeks, IdrA's probably not playing Protoss, but if he is, he's probably like making a sentry here for the follow-up push. This was like the running joke in GSL when GSL finally happened a few months later, when Wings of Liberty officially came out and it wasn't just the beta, is people like Terrans kept trying to do aggressive builds like this, and Protoss players realized they could just make a force field and like safely tech. And it was the running joke that even in GSL, it was like Terran players are just going to do aggressive builds and hope to God the Protoss isn't looking at his ramp when he pushes. And oh, the Protoss player wasn't, and he airmailed and whipped his force field. That's it. The Terran's up into his base like this. And that was like the meme about early Wings of Liberty, was Terrans would just do this, and Protosses would still die to it even if they knew it was coming. And meanwhile, you had Zerg players who couldn't even take their natural, and were legitimately like having to be tested just to take their natural every game. And I think it made Zerg players sort of develop a little bit faster than the other 2 races as far as like learning how to macro and dealing with aggression. Because Zerg was definitively the worst race from when like the beginning of the beta, really until the big Queen and Overlord patch in July of 2012. So part of why I love this game, even though it's like a really ridiculous like beginning of the beta, sort of like low level like slop fest and like real scrappy game, you would call it if you were casting on a main stage, is it's Idra versus Artosis and early Wings of Liberty, and neither are playing Zerg. And I remember when I first got into StarCraft 2, I would always like discover players and then type in like their ID versus. So like say I first discovered Idra, right? Then like I discovered Stefano. So then I would type in like Idra versus Stefano into YouTube and see if they were playing any big matches or had played big matches in the past, I mean, and those replays had been casted. Had played famous games, you know, and it was always like a big thrill to see like, oh yeah, Stefano has played him. Like let's see how it went. Or like Destiny versus Idra, like oh, like you would see Destiny stream. Like I wonder how if he's ever played Idra. Like he has to. He's on playing on North America Ladder, IMMR all the time. Well, the thing is with Idra and Artosis, we're always best friends and we're always like talking banter, but you would never like find matches of them in StarCraft 2 against each other. And all of the Brood War matches they played against each other, even like the Ventrilo media practice matches, none of them were ever on YouTube. You could never find them. Well, one of them was found, and I'm going to cast that game and put it on the channel right after this one. So I sort of wanted to tease you guys with this match. This was the only Idra vs Artosis game that was out on the internet for 12 years, like for years and years and years. But I got my hands on another game that's them playing each other in Brood War, and it's the same races. Idra's playing Protoss again, but he's tormenting Artosis with Brood War Protoss. It doesn't get much better than that, so make sure you sub and hit the bell notification.